Welcome to Religion in the American Experience, a podcast that explores how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion, which can help us as we wrestle with complex questions of American governance and purpose in the 21st century. Here's your host, Chris Stevenson.
Welcome to Season 4 of Religion in the American Experience. Founded in 1834 as a mission of the Episcopal Church, the Seamen's Church Institute provides vital services to seafarers, including crisis response, pastoral care, vessel visiting, counseling, transportation, and hospitality. The organization also supports mariner education and professional development through its Center for Maritime Education and advocates for seafarer rights through its Center for Mariner Advocacy. What is the history of this unique organization? And why will an understanding of this particular religious thread in the American tapestry equip us to be more effective at perpetuating our democracy, which includes religious freedom as defined by the U.S. Constitution's Article 6 and the Bill of Rights religion clauses? Mark Nestelhutt is our guest today, and he will guide us in answering these and other questions. The Reverend Mark Nestelhutt serves as the President and Executive Director of the Seamen's Church Institute, or SCI, the largest and most comprehensive mariner service agency in North America. Mark, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Appreciate it.
First, would you share with our listeners a little bit about you and about how you became involved with the Seamen's Church Institute? I think this will be a fascinating story because I think most of us will not have heard of this organization.
Sure. So, my background is that coming out of university, I was a naval line officer, so an officer in the U.S. Navy. I went in to fly planes. That didn't happen. And then I petitioned to go into the intel community, served for 3 years in the Navy, into the reserves, and then went from there into production, security, energy, lending banking in New Orleans, um, and then joined another large bank and took a buyout and went to divinity school when I was, I guess, 32 years old. And so graduated at 35 and then went into parish ministry and found my way eventually into a maritime parish on the Chesapeake Bay, where some of my parishioners were uh, Chesapeake Bay pilots, bringing big ships up the Chesapeake Bay into Baltimore, or Delaware River pilots, doing sort of the same thing up the Delaware into Wilmington and Philadelphia, or they were tugboat captains, or they were ship engineers, the people that oversee the large propulsion units on sort of merchant marine vessels, because the large labor union, MEBA, had their main training campus actually in our parish boundaries. So it was a chance to get to know mariners and meet their families and realize, what were some of the stressors and things that happen when typically your father is away for 4 months or longer each year, or multiple times during a year. And then with that experience, Seaman's Church came looking for another executive director, and I think they felt that my background lended itself to that. So that was how I got here.
Wow, what a great story. Okay. Fascinating, fascinating. I live in Northern Virginia, so near the Chesapeake Bay. So that's where were you? Uh, where was your parish there?
So I was in St. Michael's, Maryland, if you've ever been there.
No, I don't think I have. Okay, have to go visit. Um, okay, great. So let's dive in here. What is the origin story of the Seamen's Church Institute, which was first organized in 1834, as I said, but under the name Young Men's Church Missionary Society?
Right. So yeah, our first name was the Young Men's Church Missionary Society of the Protestant Episcopal Church in New York City, I think, something along those lines. And so the origin story was there were a lot of organizations. This is the sort of early evangelical period coming out of the Second Great Awakening. The idea was to try and Christianize more parts of the world and more parts of the community. And so a group of young men came together, um, much like sort of a junior league. So these would be sort of the younger members of society, and they wanted to run a mission society. And so in 1834, we started doing your typical mission efforts, which were providing missionaries to go out into the hinterlands. Of course, at that time, the hinterlands consisted of places like Western North Carolina and Ohio. And so we funded mission efforts in those areas. And then around 1830 or around 1843 or a couple of years before that, I think they did a sort of a deeper dive into what really are the pressing needs. And rather than sort of dissipate our efforts by sending a little money here, a little money there, what should we focus on? And they chose to focus on the seafarers coming into the port of New York, which at that time was the second largest port in the world and the largest port in the United States. Um, and so you had thousands of seafarers, tens of thousands of seafarers coming into New York City every day. And they were all in the lower sort of Bowery section of Manhattan, or actually the Battery section of Manhattan. And so that was the group that they chose to minister to and to have missionaries to. So it was sort of like close to home, I guess you'd say.
So originally it was a missionary society go to spread the gospel, and then they chose a few years later to focus on seafarers coming. Were they wanting to just help them in general to support them, or were they wanting to share the gospel with these seafarers? Was that their intent?
So it was twofold. It was both to share the gospel because that was sharing the good news, and so that's why, as you note, we have had things like floating chapels and boarding houses and things. But really, it gets to the challenges that were confronting seafarers at that time, and alcohol was a big issue. So there was the temperance movement, and that was one of the first things that the missionary society chose to try and tackle. The other was just how seafarers were often um, uh, mistreated by the people on land. And what that would look like is a seafarer would come in off a ship. They would not be paid as of yet because seafarers weren't paid until the cargo was sold. And so they might be in port for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks or longer while the ship is unloading and while the cargo is being sold. And basically, you had boarding house operators who would extend them credit. And so they would continue to serve them, alcohol. Prostitution was sort of another component of that. And what would often happen is by the time the seafarer was paid and able to leave, the seafarer actually owed more to the boarding house operator than they'd actually earned. And so they would often get signed back out on contracts. So these people were often known as crimps or even, by the more telling name land sharks. Um, and so Seamen's Church really went in and wanted to solve sort of these practical issues. So one was addressing temperance, the other was setting up clean boarding houses that were more affordable, where you might have Bible studies offered, you wouldn't have alcohol being served. Um, and so that's, there's the practical aspects of how you look after someone coming in who's been at sea for a number of months and try and make them feel welcome and taken care of and not taken advantage of. So that's when we get into sort of, as I said, the more tangible, practical aspects of the service provided by the Seamen's Church Institute.
Sounds like they really filled a need. Who were those original young men? Do we know who the original group was that formed this organization at the very beginning?
So it was a mix of it was all men. I think there were 17 of them on the board when reconstituted in 1843. It included many of the people were actually clergy. They were the rectors or senior pastors of the largest Episcopal churches in Manhattan at the time. I think the furthest one north was St. Thomas, Fifth Avenue, which is up by sort of now Rockefeller Center. And then also, of course, the rector of Trinity Church, which was sort of Trinity Church Wall Street, now Trinity Church in New York City, who became the chair of the board at one point. So, and then mostly in addition to um, uh, clergy, it was constituted by attorneys and by people, sort of other professionals, either in insurance or
Okay.
something along those lines, or finance.
But the original young men who started it in 1834, this was just a group of these were not church leaders, is that right?
Oh no, it was also a mix of
Okay.
clergy and laity,
Okay. All right.
but it was all male.
All male. Yeah, yeah. Got it. So SCI, as you say, built a church on a boat called the Floating Church of the Holy Comforter. I don't remember what year this was, but tell us a little bit about this. When was it built? What did it do? How long did it last?
So I think that was about the same time that we began shifting our focus. So probably around 1843. It was just one of four chapels that we ultimately operated, which were all floating chapels. It was not an idea original to the Seamen's Church Institute. We looked across the sea to our sort of fellow societies in England, where they were already doing this. Sailor Society, I think, was one of those. And so modeled on that, you would take a barge and you would literally build and construct a large church aboard it, one that would seat maybe, 3 or 400 people. And it was to provide religious services, and they could be sort of floated right at the not at the moorings, but at the berths, right where the wharves were and the piers coming into New York City. So we had one on the East River, and then we had one on what would have been called the North River, which is now called the Hudson River. And for decades, we operated those floating chapels. Um, People from other parishes would actually pay or subscribe to these because it's back when pew rentals were done. And it was a way of them donating that and those pews for seafarers who ultimately would not pay them, weren't always, regular attendees, to be able to come and worship in that space. So even that was funded as a charitable effort when it was done.
Right. I'm guessing that these were open to all, no matter their faith or lack thereof. It wasn't this is an Episcopal organization, but I'm guessing that
Right.
those chapels were open to any and all. Is that
That
true? Yeah.
that is correct. So they were open to all people, regardless of their. I mean, they tended to be very focused on Christians at the time.
Right.
And of course, many of the seafarers at that time were from either the United States or from Northern Europe and the United Kingdom. So while they might not have been Episcopalians or Church of England, there were certainly a number of Lutheran seafarers, and everyone was sort of welcome. This is also an era when many Lutheran organizations, there might be a Norwegian seafarers mission, there might be a Swedish seafarers mission, a German seafarers mission. So in some ways, you were, I would say Seamen's Church was probably focused on English-speaking Christians, um, coming out of
Okay.
probably a more Church of England, Episcopal Presbyterian kind of background,
Okay.
Methodist, something like that.
So there were other similar organizations run by other denominations, but this
Yes,
one sort of lasted it has become the largest and
right. At one point, I think there were something like 30 of these just in
oh,
the New York area.
okay.
Uh, So, and again, you still have some of these, they just don't necessarily focus on ministering to seafarers any longer. They become sort of cultural institutions for Norwegian expatriates living in New York City or
Okay.
Swedish expatriates or something like that.
Right. Okay. And when did those, floating churches go by the wayside? When was the
Uh,
last?
yeah, I think the last one of those was in the early 20th century. And I believe I remember reading somewhere that it was actually floated across to Staten Island, put on a sledge, dragged up on shore, and it functioned as a parish church until I wanna say, I think it caught fire maybe Christmas Eve of 1939 or something like that. So,
Wow.
the buildings were repurposed.
Okay. Um, I guess what made them, obsolete?
Well, in 1912, we launched a major initiative to build what became known as the Millionaire Seafarers Hotel or Center, where wonderful people like the Astor family and the Morgan family and the Vanderbilts contributed resources along with others. And we were able to build what was a 12-story seafarer hotel, which had something like 750 beds. But in addition to that, it had a restaurant, it had a tailor shop, it had a I'm trying to what is that? Medical clinic, dental clinic, obstetrician, um, I'm sorry, optician, um, all sort of, all sorts of services for seafarers under one roof, including we operated post office boxes for 10,000 seafarers. So
Okay. And was there a chapel in that building?
absolutely, there was a chapel in that building. There were recreation spaces, and there was also a school, maritime school, in the building as well.
Wow. I've seen pictures of that. That's quite a building. It makes sense that the Astors and others contributed. It was an amazing building. Is it still in existence, the building itself?
It is not. So that building was in existence from, we broke ground in 1912. Actually, one of the stories is, true stories, is that when the Bishop of New York and the Mayor of New York were at the laying of the cornerstone, it's the morning that we found out of the sinking of the Titanic. Um, so the building opened in 1913 with a Titanic memorial, which was a lighthouse memorial above it. That's now located in the South Street Seaport Museum in New York City. Um, the building opened in 1913. We sold that building in, I think, 1967, It was demolished to make way for a new skyscraper, and then we built another building, smaller, with about 375 beds in 1968, and that operated until, I believe, the early 1980s. Um,
And okay. And then I think you built something in New Jersey, is that
well, that's later, and that was actually a
okay.
seafarer center, not a hotel. That really was built to address the shifting face of our changing face of shipping
Right.
due to
Yeah.
containerization.
Okay, and we'll
We
get to
did
that.
build another building in Lower Manhattan, which was at 241 Water Street over in the Seaport. That was not a hotel. It had a restaurant, a museum, and training facilities in addition to a chapel in our offices.
Okay. Let's see, I wanna chat a bit about what is, I guess, your longest running program. I had never heard of it, um, but apparently it's, quite a program, continues to this day, but started during the Spanish-American War, I think, Christmas at Sea program. Can you tell us a little bit about the origin story of that and what's going on today?
Christmas at Sea was an effort started by a group of knitters in 1898 during the midst of the Spanish-American War. And it was a way to provide cold weather garments for those who were sailing from northern climes down to the Caribbean. Um, and since they were going to be away at Christmas, it was branded as Christmas at Sea. These were ditty bags that were filled with handmade knitted items, along with toiletries and other kinds of chocolates and gifts and things. And they were given to the seafarers and those who were going to be heading down during that period of our nation's history. And fast forward, it's something that we've been doing every year since. Now we have about, under 1,000 knitters throughout all 50 states, plus in, I think, 5 additional countries. And they knit roughly, 30,000 handmade items every year. And we distribute those to international seafarers on the Eastern Seaboard. And also, we actually also distribute those to U.S. Jones Act mariners piloting towboats and tugboats and the coast and also in the inland waterways. And so it's a year-round effort, and our chaplains are the ones that take them on board. And it's just to remind people that at Christmas time, people are thinking about them and appreciating all that they're doing, and the fact that while we're at home with our families, they're not able to be home with theirs.
Well, maybe some of the, listeners will are knitters and will join you. I know I sent it to my son and, daughter-in-law who knit. I said, "Never heard of this, you might be interested," so okay, so in 1906, the name was changed to the Seamen's Church Institute of New York. What is the significance of that?
So our name was the Protestant Episcopal Missionary Society to Seafarers in the Port and City of New York, which was a long name.
That is a long
And
name.
so one of our long-term board members, a guy named Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was famous for as a naval, not historian, but strategist in projecting naval power, was on our board. And the apocryphal story is, we don't know if it's true, that he was casting about for a new name, said, "Who is it that we serve?" And the response was, "Seamen." And they said, "And under whose auspices?" And it was the churches. "And what kind of work do we do?" Institutional. So that is how it became Seamen's Church Institute of New York. Then in the 1970s, we became the Seamen's Church Institute of New York and New Jersey. And then in the early 2020s, we became the Seamen's Church Institute, representing the fact that we are now spread out across the nation and not just um, we're headquartered in New York, but we're not only solely focusing on New York and New Jersey any longer.
Okay. We talked about that, 12-story building that opened in the early 20th century. Yeah, I found this interesting that, uh, something called the Medico Rooftop Radio Doctor's Office was put in that building or functioned out of that building. Tell us about this.
Yep. So, as I said, with the floating chapels, that was something we plagiarized or borrowed from our brethren across the sea. We actually piloted telemedicine. In 1920, we launched a ship-to-shore radio service because most ships did have a shortwave radio at that point, and we were able. And the challenge was, while they might have a medical chest and medical kit on board, not everybody or anybody on board. They certainly didn't have a physician, but knew how to use it. And so this was a way that ships at sea would be able to radio in, and it would be, it's like you're from one radio operator to another, to the top of our building where we had a switchboard that literally then transferred them over to a doctor on call at a hospital in Manhattan who was able to then provide medical advice based on symptoms. And that was something that was later taken over by RCA and then by the US government. But it was
Wow.
something that we piloted, right?
What a great story. Yeah, yeah, I guess most ships won't have a doctor, right? I mean, some certainly do, but
Cruise ships do, but most merchant vessels no.
right.
And it was actually it's not surprising, it was a little surprising that in 2020, it was the 100th anniversary of the creation of, telemedicine for the maritime community, and there was a conference held to sort of mark that, and it was sort of, noted that Seamen's Church had introduced that in 1920.
Wow. That must have been a great thing for seamen, right?
Well, I think it certainly improved their level of, medical care while they were out at sea.
Sure, yeah. Okay. What so World War One, World War Two, early 20th century, big events, lots of touching of the oceans. What was SCI's role during those conflicts? What did they do? What are some of the stories there?
Yeah. So during World War II, we were welcoming seafarers as they were coming in, because in addition to Navy and Coast Guard, you also had merchant mariners who were transporting goods back and forth across the sea. The sinking of the Lusitania. You had all kinds of things that were happening that were putting seafarers' lives under threat. So we actually would welcome these seafarers into our hotel, make sure that people felt that their needs were being taken care of. If you fast forward around that same period of the First World War, we moved much more heavily into our training efforts. So while we'd started our training at the turn of the previous century, so about 1899, um, as we advanced that, as a way of really allowing seafarers to advance their own careers, we became more involved in new technologies, and so we were providing training. We, at one point, actually took over operation of the, New York Nautical School, which much later became State University of New York Maritime College, and operated that along with the YMCA of New York City for a brief period of time. But it really on the eve of the Second World War is when we moved more heavily into training, and so during the Second World War, we had a rooftop flying bridge on the 13th floor of the building, that replicated the ship's bridge, and then we had an indoor bridge on the 12th floor, and we would do officer training for the merchant maritime community, and also for officers who were gonna serve on these vessels and also on, naval vessels, and I believe the numbers we trained about 11,000, um, merchant marine officers during the Second World War.
Okay. Now, it seems like the SCI does a lot of stuff for these people that wasn't really directly religious. Um,
Um,
but to talk to us a little bit about that. This is a religious organization. You still do those things, but there's a lot of other things. Are they all tied to religious concepts, et cetera? Just help us understand this a bit.
sure, and let me also say one of the other things that we did is, we've always had a corps of chaplains back in
Mhm.
the day where they would have all been Episcopal priests primarily, or maybe a few deacons. But we also, during the Second World War, some of our chaplains were transferred into service to be chaplains aboard merchant vessels that were crossing the North Atlantic during the war. So we actually had sailing chaplains from the Seamen's Church who were working in the maritime community as well. Uh,
Okay.
Functioning in the role much like a Navy chaplain aboard a ship or a Navy chaplain embedded in a Marine Corps unit or a Coast Guard unit or something like that. Uh,
Okay.
but yes, but I think, what we say is that Seamen's Church meets the material, the personal, and spiritual needs of seafarers. And so, um, if you wanna look at even in the past, but if you look more present, when someone comes offshore or comes off a ship, or when you go on board a ship and they have a particular issue, you don't lead with prayer. You really wanna say, you wanna be pastorally present for them. And so I think our
Right.
chaplains talk about ministry of presence, which is kind of what it always was. Um, in a time when more seafarers were Christian, It often meant that you were doing services on board ship, you were doing prayer services, Bible studies while the ships were in port. You might do a religious Eucharist or a Mass, celebration of communion, something like that, for those seafarers on board, because that met their spiritual needs. We would give out, Bibles, prayer books, prayer tracts, things like that. Um, but there are also the material needs that seafarers have when they come ashore. They're far from home still, even if they're coming into a port it's far away from their home city. Um,
Right.
so we would set up dances. We would set up athletic competitions, soccer games, rugby games, things like that. We had playing fields for them to play on.
Yeah.
Um, and and then also transportation to be able to get them either to see the sights of the city, to get to and from our hotel, to go sightseeing, um, transportation to shopping malls more recently. So there were sort of, I would say, tangible resources you could provide to seafarers to make them feel welcome. And
Right.
I think the Episcopal Church is a little unique in that our understanding of mission, even in the 19th century, sort of the pithy statement was good schools, clean hospitals, and right ordered worship. The idea being that
Mm.
you're really trying to provide for the welfare of people, in the idea that we're meeting human needs in the here and now, not only looking to save lives for the afterlife or save souls
Mhm.
for the afterlife. So
Yeah.
I think we often lead with meeting those tangible needs and making sure that we're not trading services for some sort of religious participation.
Sure.
And that really comes into focus in the 1960s, but certainly by the 1980s and the 2000s with the tremendous demographic change in the composition of
Yeah.
seafarers or national seafarers.
Let's get into that, Mark. So in the 1950s, I don't know, 53, 54, container shipping was introduced, and this, from what I understand, revolutionized your world. Uh, how did SCI react to this? And you mentioned a little bit about the also the demographics. That's maybe a connected story, but talk to us about the mid 20th century onward. That revolution. What happened?
Right. So up until the 1950s, cargo was sort of break cargo. You saw pallets being lifted off, loose items being lifted off in crates, or individual items coming out of the hull of the ship, and that is why it would take weeks for ships to be unloaded once they were in port. So if
Okay.
you were a seafarer, you would be off that ship for a number of weeks at a time, or living on the ship but in port with able to have shore leave, while you were waiting for your ship to be unloaded. In 1956, an individual in the trucking industry named Malcolm McLean decided to put ship chassis and sort of boxes on board a old tanker ship, a converted tanker ship, and sail it to another port. He renamed that vessel the Ideal X, and it sailed from the port of New York, well, from Port Newark, New Jersey, to Houston, Texas. And that was the first introduction of containerization, or what becomes containerized shipping, where you see these TEUs on board ships. Typically, what we see are double TEUs that are about 40 feet long, that basically carry the cargo inside and can be literally offloaded from the ship by crane directly onto the chassis of a truck, or in some cases, directly onto a rail car for transport. And what that did is it sped up the time that a ship spends in port. So it used to be said that before the 1960s, before the 1980s, a seafarer spent about 80% of their time in port and 20% of their time at sea.
Mm.
Fast forward to now, a seafarer spends about 80% of their time at sea and 20% of their time in port, and that's still decreasing, that amount of time they spend in port, because a cargo ship, especially a container ship, might come in port and only be in a terminal for 8 to 12 hours. Um,
Wow. Big
so
difference.
that's sort of the change, and that's what happened with containerization, is it changed the face of shipping and the seafarer lifestyle, and it also is why you see fewer and fewer seafarer hotels, still around, because there weren't seafarers to use them.
I see. Okay. All right. So how did SCI respond to this early on and over the first few decades? What changed for you?
Well, as the face of shipping changed, the size of the ports needs changed. So ports needed to become larger as the ships became larger. And so in the port of New York and New Jersey, you see a shift from lower Manhattan They'd expanded into Brooklyn. Now you're seeing everything shifting over to the marshlands of New Jersey. What we think of now as Bayonne, Port Newark, Port Elizabeth, um, and all of our facilities were in Lower Manhattan, where they had been since the 1840s. And so what we did is we signed a lease with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey in 1960, and we opened an International Seafarer Center in Port Newark, New Jersey. First as a low-slung building, then we expanded that, and then we recently renovated that about a decade ago. So it's a modern-day seafarer center right in the port that offers it's where our port chaplains are based out of, so it's where we do our ship visiting from. We have van drivers who do the van transport for seafarers, and then we also have a hospitality staff in place, and it's also actually the headquarters for the Christmas at Sea program. So that's all under that one roof and about a gosh, I'm not sure how large that building is, maybe 30,000 square feet or something like that, I guess.
Okay. Okay. So quite a change. Uh, Tell us a little bit about the change in the demographics of seafarers. You mentioned that earlier. This is connected, I'm guessing.
Right. So, starting in the 1960s, but progressing in the 1980s and beyond, you had what one of my predecessors referred to as West meets East, meaning all of a sudden, um, port chaplains in the United States who were used to greeting people from Europe, who might be Christian, were now welcoming an increasing number of people from other parts of the world. Now there been, going back to the end of the Second World War and beyond, a number of Filipino seafarers, and Filipino seafarers still make up the majority or not, still make up the largest single nationality for seafarers, international seafarers. At one point, until recently, they were the majority of international seafarers. So if you say there were 1.6 million seafarers worldwide, the Filipino population would have been more than 800,000 of them.
Mm.
Uh, Now it's no longer the majority, but it's the largest single nationality within international shipping. And you've then seen beyond that an increase in the number of seafarers from China, from Malaysia, from Russia, and other parts of the world, India. And so it's much more likely that a ship coming into the port of New York and New Jersey or anywhere in the United States now, at least on the eastern seaboard, will have a crew that is maybe made up of Filipino seafarers and ratings. It might have Indian seafarers, um, could be Russian, Chinese, but in many cases, with the exception of the Filipino seafarers, they're not practicing Christians by and large. Um, so you have an in-faith dialogue rather than an ecumenical dialogue.
Right.
And so Seamen's Church is part of a larger organization called the International Christian Maritime Association, which is headquartered out of London. It's called ICMA for short. And ICMA has 28 national associations around the globe that do port chaplaincy work for seafarers. Um, and there is a code of conduct, and one of the requirements of that is that you don't proselytize, meaning that you don't trade services for you don't make a seafarer attend a Bible study before you're going to provide
Right.
transportation for them or offer them food or something like that. And so you were really careful about what our chaplains do when they get on board. So the main thing is it's a ministry of presence. Our chaplains get on. You quickly know what the nationality is. Fortunately for us, the international language of seafaring is English. So at least most of your officers or all of your officers and a number of your ratings, which are sort of your crew, are going to speak some level of English. And they're going to have things that they need. They don't get a lot of shore leave any longer. And if they're able to get granted shore leave and you can provide transportation, then they can buy their own items that they need. Sometimes if they're not able to get shore leave, they'll need, our chaplains or hospitality team to do the shopping for them. Um, Sometimes they need SIM cards or SIM card replacements or new SIM cards. Uh, but all kinds of things, it's whatever you can do. Back
Right.
during COVID was trying to make sure that seafarers could get vaccinated so they could continue their work. So we
Yeah.
putting medical crews on board, or you were then taking, seafarers away to a clinic so they could be immunized against COVID in the early days.
And we'll talk a little bit about COVID, if there's more to say, but I wanted to ask, with your chaplains, how do they interact spiritually with these are Christian chaplains with the SCI, I'm assuming. Maybe you have other faith chaplains, but how do they interact with those of other faiths? I mean, in a spiritual way. I'm sure they want to minister to them. Maybe they're asked to minister to them in some spiritual way that's not there's no match between faiths. What's the experience there?
Yeah, well, the experience is you're putting yourself forward to help meet that person's needs, and if that person's needs is a pastoral conversation, it doesn't matter what their faith tradition is, because usually the pastoral conversation is gonna come out of some sense of loss, a sense of worry, concern about their parents back home, spouse back home, children back home, or
Yeah.
something along those lines, and not being present or being able to be with, because you can miss events, right? You go to sea on a 9-month contract, and one of your parents might die while you're away, and you might not be able to get repatriated off your ship. So you might wanna have a conversation about what it felt like not to be able to be present with your other, family and friends at your parents' funeral service or something, or you might miss a
Right.
birthday, you might be missing your child. So those cut across all sorts of not only denominational, but also, faith traditional lines.
Yeah, sure. What are the what do chaplains hear most of? What are the biggest complaints is the wrong word, but the biggest worries that seafarers have, concerns, things that they need pastoral care for?
Um So, I'm gonna say at least two things. One is concern about family back home, because now seafarers are much more connected. It used to be that when you were a seafarer, and you got on a ship, you didn't have any interaction really with the people back on shore until you came ashore. There was a Greek philosopher about the same era as Plato who said that there are 3 types of people: the living, the dead, and those who are at sea, meaning that when your family members sailed away, you didn't know if they were alive or dead until they sailed back into their home port.
Right.
Um, Now seafarers are much more connected, right? Because many ships have Starlink or some other mobile access to Wi-Fi and in the internet service wherever they are around the globe, or have to be located around the globe. And so if your spouse back at home is having a problem, or your child is ill or having some sort of medical problem, you're gonna know about it in real time. And at the
Yeah.
same time, you can't do anything about it, right? You're on a ship tens of thousands of miles away, but you can worry and you can be concerned. And I think a lot of it is sometimes what do you do as a person who is worried, wishes you could be with your son or daughter or your spouse during this time, but you can't be. And then having pastoral conversations around that, um, or trying to figure out ways that in some cases you could work with the company or work with the agents to see if there is a way that a seafarer could be repatriated in order to get back for a funeral or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a piece of it.
Okay. Okay, tell us a little bit more about COVID. What was the impact of COVID on seafarers and shipping, and how did SEI adapt and respond to meet these needs?
Well, COVID was, the rest of the world shut down during COVID. We all stayed at home, isolated in place, um, but shipping went on, and so seafarers were still at sea. But because of the actions, you know, not surprising, of various nation states and governments, shore leave was not granted. So seafarers could come into a port. They had their PPE for safety and everything, but our chaplains couldn't get on ships to interact with them. They couldn't get off ships to interact with anybody else. And so everybody had to adapt, not just Seamen's Church, but all of the seafarer welfare organizations around the globe. And we did it in similar ways. In many cases, we set up chat with a chaplain, sort of through WhatsApp or WeChat or Facebook, to try and have ways for seafarers to be able to know that they could reach out and have a conversation with a chaplain. We set up a shopping organization called Shop at Sea, where the entire vessel crew would email in an Amazon order, and we would arrange to have the Amazon order delivered to our facilities. We'd track it by ship. We then track by marine traffic when the ship was going to be in port. When it came in port, we would load up the van or the car. We'd take that entire package. We'd go up the gangway. It would be dropped off on the gangway. You leave, they would come out, and then they would sort of take their packages so that they could continue to receive these things. Um, And so you had a chat with the chaplain, you had that, you had ongoing pastoral visits where you could talk, but again, you were socially distanced from one another. But all of those things were happening during the early stages of COVID. You also, of course, had seafarers who were dying at sea, and one of the things that Seamen's Church does is work with repatriation of bodies. So if a ship comes into port and there's a deceased seafarer on board, usually there's a chaplain there along with the coroner's office to be there when the body comes off, and or the remains come off. And so we continued to do that. Um, and then when vaccines became available, we worked with local governments to try and figure out how you could vaccinate seafarers. Many of us wanted the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine. Not as many people wanted the Johnson and Johnson J&J one shot and you're done. But that worked really well for the seafarer community because you could give a seafarer a vaccine and you didn't have to say be back in 21 days or 28 days for your second shot because you would see them again. And so New York State, New Jersey both freed up a large supply of J&J vaccines that could be used with seafarers from all over the world who didn't have access to vaccines in their home countries to be able to be vaccinated against COVID, which gave them job security, allowed them to continue to work, to continue to serve and be employed, and to continue to provide for their families back at home.
Wow. I never thought of seafarers during COVID, I don't think.
Well, no one did, and the other thing that happened was, you know, you'll structure a study to sort of learn from it. Um, you could have never gone to an organization and said, "I wanna try and test something." Right now, the longest that a seafarer could serve on a ship is 11 months. What if we leave some on board for up to 2 years, but never grant them shore leave during that 2-year period? What would that be like? You could never run that study because it would be considered cruel and unusual. But that's exactly what happened during COVID. So in COVID, you had seafarers who were on ships sometimes for 2 years. They couldn't be repatriated back home to their home countries. They weren't getting shore leave. So you saw a huge increase in suicidal ideation, huge increase in completed suicides aboard vessels. Um, so we learned from that. And I think the idea or what really grew out of that is much more of a focus on providing for seafarer mental health and well-being through telemedicine and telemedicine services specifically for mental health concerns. And many private companies stepped into that void. A lot of medical schools stepped into that void as well. And so that's something now that almost every ship or every seafarer on board a ship has access to is mental health support and trying to destigmatize mental health uh, concerns and treat them like any other sort of ailment or injury.
I actually wanted to ask about mental health because as I was preparing for this podcast, I read that um, one of the real issues for seafarers is isolation. Um, w- and you mentioned a rise in suicide ideation and actual completed suicides during COVID. What's the mental health landscape out there for seafarers?
Well, it is by its very nature isolating work. You're working long hours, you're standing watch. When you're off, you're basically doing everything you need to do. Your laundry, trying to get some sleep, trying to eat. And then one of the downsides, perhaps, of the connectivity we have is now rather than hanging out with your fellow crew members in the crew mess or lounge and socializing or, you know, doing karaoke or playing video games or something, and people are doing that in their own rooms.
Yeah.
They're just downloading movies and watching Netflix or something. So I think that can contribute to the sense of isolation. And a lot of captains or masters of the vessels and companies are trying to create initiatives to make crews be a little more engaged with one another while they're at sea, so that we don't see that same degree of isolation. But by its very nature, being a seafarer is isolating.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, before we get to the last question, which I ask all guests, anything, Mark, we need to know about SCI in 2025 or 2026 now, right?
Yeah, so in 2026, we're still doing the same kind of work we were doing in 1843. We're doing it in different ways. So it's, as they say, don't put new wine in old wineskins. But I think the throughput of what we do is very similar. So our mission is threefold. First and foremost, our reason for being was pastoral care and chaplaincy services. So we continue to do that. That's not only vessel visits on board towboats and barges and assist tugs and merchant and, tankers and uh, freighters and cargo ships and things. It's also crisis response. So we often get called into a crisis when there's been a fatality aboard a ship, where first responders, all of our chaplains are trained in critical incident stress management, which is called SISM, and applied suicide intervention skills training. Um, and we have chaplains with grab and go bags because you never know when you're going to be called into service. So, the container ship Dolly allies with the Francis Scott Key Bridge, and the ship is trapped under the bridge in the middle of Baltimore Harbor. We were asked to provide chaplains to work with a crew to come on board, sent them out by launch. Um, a couple of years ago, we had the mid-air collision here in Washington between the U.S. Black Hawk helicopter and the American Airlines jetliner. The company that was running and operating the recovery, what was search and rescue related recovery vessel, asked for a chaplain to work with their seafarers or mariners on board because what they were seeing was gruesome. It's not what they were used to seeing as they were watching body parts being pulled up from the Potomac. The Potomac, the Mexican training vessel that backed into the Brooklyn Bridge, resulting in the death of some of their cadets. We ministered to that crew as well. Um, More recently, we are working right now with uh, through the U.S. Coast Guard of providing chaplains to go out on board and work with the crews of the tankers that have been seized for sanction violations to make sure that the seafarers are being looked after. So all of that work continues to happen. In addition, on the training side, we continue to do training and advancing mariner skills and skill sets. And we also do engineering studies as well to try and maintain safety for the maritime environment, whether that's a port expansion or putting in a new bridge over a span of water. And then we also do e-learning services for seafarers with about 10,000 plus enrolled in that so that they can continue their training on something as small as a smartphone. And then our last area is the advocacy piece, where we work on seafarer rights and advocacy issues, which can range from being at the International Maritime Organization in London, the International Labour Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, working closely with the Coast Guard, as we are doing currently on this other issue, and then also working on mariner mental health issues for the inland maritime by figuring out how can we work to create a network of mental health professionals, licensed mental health professionals, sort of one step beyond chaplains who are trained in that work, but also better understand what a mariner lifestyle is like. What are the triggers for that person? What are the stressors for that person? So that when they are doing telemedicine to them, they have a better understanding of the person that's on the other end of the Zoom call or the phone call. So all of those things that we continue to do, we're still growing, we're still adding chaplains, and we're sort of expanding our footprint, and we feel that it's God's work. So I know it's probably an apocryphal saying that attributed to Saint Francis: "Preach the gospel at all times, use words when necessary," but that's kind of our mantra.
Yep, makes sense. Great work you're doing, Mark. So as we conclude, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from your understanding of and work with the Seamen's Church Institute, either in terms of important historical transformations you have noticed, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
Well, I think it's telling to me that global shipping companies, regardless of where they're headquartered, and the United States Coast Guard and local authorities often look to the religious community to provide for seafarer welfare. It came out of Christian-based organizations, but even with all of the pluralism that we see now, around the globe, it really is still religious denominations, whether it's the Roman Catholic Church under the auspices of Stella Maris and Apostleship of the Sea, whether it's the Anglican Communion through Mission to Seafarers, whether it's the Reformed churches through Sailor Society, the Norwegian, the Swedish, the Finnish churches, um, Danish church, German church, all of those are continuing to provide almost all of the seafarer welfare support in the ports around the globe. So ICMA has representation in about 800 ports globally. And it's interesting to me that it's still we're entrusted by these governments and these shipping countries or companies to be the ones that are providing these services to really make sure that seafarers are taken care of and that their welfare is looked after. So that's telling me that there's still a great value in the services that we offer, and I think we do it as a way of not necessarily converting people to Christianity, but it's how we live out our own Christian faith in our service to others. And I think that that's how all of the associations that are part of ICMA, and certainly how all of our chaplains at Seamen's Church Institute experience their work and ministry and mission.
Okay, beautiful. You have the last word. We have been speaking with the Reverend Mark Nestelhutt, President and Executive Director of the Seamen's Church Institute. Mark, I appreciate you offering your time and your extensive knowledge to help us learn about the history of this fascinating and unique institution and its current work today. It has equipped us to be better stewards of religion's role in perpetuating the American experiment in self government. So, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate you having me on the program, and it's wonderful to get to meet you.
Religion in the American Experience is produced by the private Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Scholarly support is provided by Dr. Lauren Turek and audio and video assistance by Dr. Randall Stevens. The music was composed by Evan Chamberlain.